But just to introduce myself, I'm Juranko. I teach at the Vanderbilt Divinity School. It includes classes on church and ecology and other community development type of courses. I also do prison work there. I'm the Nashville district of the United Methodist Church also has a Creation Care Ministries, and I staff that. And I also kind of coordinate the Nashville, Tennessee Interfaith Power and Light here. And so wear a number of different hats, a number of different roles. And my colleague John, why don't you stand up? And
I'm John Williamson, and I used to teach at Vanderbilt in the engineering school, and I'm a retired faculty member and have been for a number of years. I'm here to say attaboy when he gets in trouble or something. But hopefully at the end we'll have a chance to answer questions from you all or discuss this, and maybe between the two of us and you will reach some conclusion here.
I'd love to know who's in the room, so why don't everybody just say your name, and if you're with a house of worship or an organization or something like that, you can share that too, but if that's not the case, you can do that also. Deanna, why don't you start?
My name is Deanna. I'm with the Nashville Climate Action Team.
I'm David Boykish. I'm with the Sierra Club. I used to be a member of Methodist Church, but I'm an elder in the Presbyterian Church right now.
You see, I'm with West End United Methodist Church, Creation Care.
Francis Duvall, a longtime Audubon member, and goes to the Second Presbyterian.
Kelly Latour, I'm the tech guy's daughter and a student, and I'm to a student club. And then James Latour, tech guy's wife, member with Methodist Church.
Skip Sharon, Alderman.
Arlene Wilson, Christ Church Cathedral, Nashville, member of everything, Sierra Club, Audubon, you name it.
Again, I'm John Williamson. I am with the Bellmead United Methodist Church.
Margaret Williamson, and I'm with Bellmead United Methodist Church.
I'm Roger Parker. I'm on the pastoral staff of this congregation. United Methodist.
Tish Rainey, nurse midwife, Methodist Roots.
I'm Carolyn Meadows. I'm from Portland, United Methodist Church there.
Bob Allen. I'm a member of Christ Church Cathedral in Nashville. Born and raised Methodist, but I'm Episcopalian now. And I long been active in environmental organizations, including the Sierra Club in Tennessee.
I'm Jim Lowe. I taught at Swan many years, retired, and I'm also a member of Christ Church and have been giving some lectures on the science of global warming where I'm retired.
Martha Lowe, Christ Church.
I'm Joe McCaleb, retired environmental lawyer, and I am a member of Christ United Methodist.
I'm Mark Bennett. I'm a member here.
And I'm going to thank a great group here, and I'm going to ask one other question, and just don't be embarrassed whichever answer you give. Would you consider yourself knowing a lot, very little, or somewhere in between around climate change? I'm going to start with a lot. Who thinks they know a lot about climate change? Okay. And who thinks they know a little? Okay. And who thinks they're somewhere in between?
I know a lot because I heard you speak before.
Okay, and so I'm going to run you through a presentation that I use in a lot of Methodist adult Sunday school classes. It's I would say this is the mainstream science. It's probably leans on the conservative side actually in terms of what the threat is. But it's also, I think, a presentation that tends to, I present to folks, some who are very passionate about climate change and others who are somewhat skeptical about it. And so it's a presentation that, that opens up a conversation with both. And part of what we need to do, I think, is just to really, there's a lot of uncertainty around this issue out there. And part of it, I don't mean uncertainty about the science of the issue, but a lot of uncertainty amongst folks. There's a lot of uncertainty amongst folks out there just saying, well, what should I believe? And so this presentation is intended to kind of lead people through that a little bit. And so if you have questions along the way, feel free to do so. And just start out with scripture from my own tradition and the Jewish tradition. Psalm 21, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and they that dwell therein. And also from Hosea 2:18, I will make a covenant for you on that day with the wild animals, the birds of the air, and the creeping things of the ground. And so, according to my tradition, we're brought into covenant with the larger creation. And part of that covenant is that we are to care for the larger creation. And so again, anytime I would talk in a Sunday school or whatnot, I might go into this, to this more. And we actually, I work with Paul Slentz, and we kind of pair on this. And he does the piece around our tradition and creation care, and I tend to focus on the science a little bit. We all know that climate change, at least I think that you're here, that you feel that it's a major issue and a problem. This is a cartoon from John. What if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? And so, yes, I think that we very much definitely, by addressing climate change, we're also, I believe, creating a better and more just world. 2015 was the hottest year ever on average across the globe. Something, and even worse, the 10 hottest years on record have all been since 1998 in terms of our recorded science. And so we're definitely in something, and this demonstrates that these are the U.S. temperature trends. Temperature goes up and down. I mean, that's what it does. Weather is not a consistent type of thing. And so weather isn't climate. If you have one hot year and one cold year, it doesn't tell you a whole lot about climate. But if you notice here, these years around the beginning of the 20th century tended down here on the cooler side, and now we have a major spike, since 1990, and particularly since 2000. There's a definite trend going on there. It's not just a single, it's a single year here and some in here, but you see a major trend happening there, and it seems to be a consistent trend across the world. You often hear about the carbon dioxide concentration, and it's currently it's over 400 parts per million, and that's a very key fact. In July 2006, CO2 levels in the atmosphere were about 382 parts per million, and just in 10 years, they've reached 404 parts per million. Now, talk a little bit about science. Science is not an absolute, but science can tell us a lot about the world. And currently, 97 out of 100 climate experts think humans are changing global temperature. That's a very high percentage. That's a strong consensus around this. And this is something I talk about because we have folks that have genuine questions around all of this. And they hear different things, and so I go over a little bit of this. Millions of years ago, the Earth was tropical to the poles, and there's evidence that CO2 concentrations were substantially higher then. The Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum event, 55 million years ago, we all, of course, remember that, was a strong warming in response to a rise in atmospheric CO2 concentrations analogous to fossil fuel release. The Earth stayed warmer than it had been for 100,000 years. That's a picture of now and then. And as the atmospheric concentration gradually fell over the past tens of millions of years, the Earth cooled and ice sheets started to form. And we're currently in what's called an interglacial climate interval, an oasis of stability compared to the bluster of the fierce glacial climate. So we're in a good place to live right now. This is kind of the Goldilocks of climate that we're in. And there have also been climate changes in the past 1,000 years, the most well-known of which are the Little Ice Age and the medieval warm period. These times correlate with apparent changes in solar luminosity. But these were not so much global. They were more regional, and the spikes were relatively short compared to what we face today. So you hear about these things, but again, those were caused by solar luminosity. But if we know that if natural rises of carbon in the atmosphere or other natural factors can cause warming, how do we know that the recent rise in temperature is not caused by natural factors? We've had changes over the years. How do we know that this is not just natural factors? So we do some detective work. And this is all from the Union of Concerned Scientists. One of the most powerful tools scientists have to find out if humans are responsible for the current increase in global warming is a technique called climate fingerprinting. In much the same way detectives analyze forensic evidence, climate scientists can study carbon molecules and graduation in temperature in the atmosphere to determine where the carbon came from. A carbon molecule and carbon dioxide emitted by the burning of a carbon molecule in fuels has a subtly different fingerprint from that of a carbon molecule and carbon dioxide from any other source. The nucleus contains fewer neutrons. And so by analyzing the revealing fingerprint, these isotopes of carbon in the atmosphere, scientists can definitively tell that the burning of fossil fuel accounts for the largest increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide since the Industrial Revolution. The factors that might account for global warming, what climate scientists call forcings, operate in observably different ways. If the warming were caused by increased energy from the sun, for instance, careful temperature measurements of all levels of the atmosphere would reveal it warm from the top straight down to the Earth's surface. And if a massive volcanic eruption, which occasionally happens, were a significant factor, their influence would show up with a distinctly different profile. But this gentleman, Benjamin Santier from Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, points out the actual temperature measurements show neither of these profiles. His research, now replicated by many other researchers around the world, instead documents a telltale warming of the lower atmosphere, the troposphere, and a cooling of the upper layer of the atmosphere or the stratosphere. And so this is the precise fingerprint scientists expect if heat-trapping carbon dioxide from fossil fuel emissions is building up in the atmosphere. And so through this carbon fingerprinting, scientists can demonstrate that this is not happening through natural factors, but it is in fact is caused by essentially industrial carbon and our various fossil fuel carbon pollutions. And again, that shows the increase in carbon just over the last 4 years. In the last 40 years, about half of the cumulative anthropocentric CO2 emissions between 1750 and 2010, essentially the Industrial Revolution, have occurred in the last 40 years. And so it's really the last 40 years, and increasingly within the last 10 years that we're seeing this massive increase in CO2 in the atmosphere. And if we just went on like we're going on our merry way, business as usual, those without additional mitigation, the result in global mean surface temperature increases by the end of this century from 3.7 degrees Celsius to 4.8 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. And so we'll have a massive explosion of carbon in the atmosphere. And the risk, and again, these are fairly conservative estimates, but 1 degree is risky. You already start seeing some change at 1 degree. At 2 degrees, it becomes highly risky. At 4 degrees, and that would be a business as usual, well above that, it would be highly risky. And we don't quite know the number of degrees where it'd be catastrophic, where basically you would start having major meltdowns of the poles and things like that. And what we would think of as civilization would be threatened. And so somewhere above 4 degrees, we're getting in that range. And even above 2 degrees, which we're approaching, we're at a highly risky place. And so we are at a very significant point here in terms of our risk. What are the risks? Desertification, droughts and water stress, changing patterns of precipitation and temperature, potential collapse of forests and biodiversity, increases in extreme weather events like hurricanes, their intensity, storm surges from seas and oceans, global sea level rise, and spread of disease vectors. What that means is particularly tropical diseases like malaria will spread into areas. And some folks even are worried that the Zika virus, that climate change is affecting the Zika virus, which could threaten us here in Tennessee, which is something I dread, given the amount of mosquitoes we have around here. So drought, extreme weather and deforestation, extreme weather. And within my tradition, the United Methodist, we're trying to eradicate malaria, but our very missions are threatened by climate change. So we have a 2-degree goal. It'd be good to keep it well under 2 degrees, but that's the point where we're getting into very high risk according to the mainstream scientists. And this can be kept to less than 2 degrees Celsius relative to pre-industrial levels at about 450 parts per million. Scientists say that with relative high confidence. And we saw we're at about 402 right now. So getting there to keeping it under 2 degrees, and again, there's others calling for well below that, at about 350 degrees parts per million. And so again, this is a more conservative mainstream presentation here. 2030, we would need to cut 60 or 70% of current emissions, with larger cuts in the developed countries. By 2050, we would need to cut 20% of current emissions, nearly carbon neutral in developed countries, and between 2050 and the end of the century, reaching zero the negative emissions. So we're going to need to get to some very high cuts even to reach this rather conservative goal by 2030, and by 2050 only being at about 20% of what we are now, and by the end of the century definitely reaching zero. And this was this was in Paris, part of the mobilization around climate change, and this was based on the Pope's walking in folks' shoes that are facing these extreme consequences of climate change. And so there was that rally. Here's the Paris talks. The Paris Agreement itself sets a fairly ambitious vision. It sets a goal to keep warming below 2 degrees Celsius, with a real goal to limit increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is much safer than the 2 degrees level. Establishes a universal approach expecting all countries to prepare, communicate, and maintain successive and ambitious nationally determined climate targets. Locks in a 5-year target cycle starting in 2020 and ratcheting up ambition over time. And also submission of ambitious national targets in 5-year cycles, providing a strong long-term market signal that the world is locking in low carbon future. And it supports transition to low carbon growth path for poor and vulnerable countries with a mobilization of over $100 billion, because there's going to be challenges for these poor countries to meet their needs. It builds on current commitments, and unfortunately the current commitments are not enough, as they would increase temperature to 3.5 degrees Celsius. So if we keep with our current commitments, we're well above, we're almost double again that 2 degrees point. And so this is only a jumping off point for revised commitments. So a hopeful vision of Paris says that we're building on current commitments, and we can build and we can make that happen. But the reality also says that our current commitments aren't nearly enough, what countries have currently committed. The one remarkable part of this is the first time that countries have, including the United States, which has been one of the countries kind of backing off from all of this, 186 of the 195 members of the convention submitted targets by the end of Paris talks, representing some 96% of global emissions. And so there is a major coming together of the countries, again, well below what we need to do. The hope is that that's a starting point. Making the transition. The keys in making this transition. First is efficiency. The International Energy Agency suggests that energy efficiency will likely account for around 40% of the total cumulative emissions reductions required through 2050 to keep on a 2-degree path. Energy efficiency is essentially everything from buildings being more efficient to motors being more, industrial motors being more efficient, all of that. There's a lot of power in energy efficiency. It reduces carbon emissions by closing coal plants. It helps lower power bills. It reduces the energy burden of low-income folks, potentials for green jobs, avoids new plant construction, cleaner air, water, and land, conserves natural resources, and is the foundation of a sustainable energy economy. And so energy efficiency is a very important piece of this. This is one possible scenario for the U.S. electric grid configuration 2050. Puts solar at about 35%. I actually think solar is going to be higher than that. I think solar is going to be very key to all this. But again, this is one possible configuration. Various biomass, geothermal, wave energy, about 25%. Wind energy, about 10 to 15%. Combined heat and power, about 10%. Solar thermal central station with 12 hours thermal storage, about 5 to 10%. Hydropower and pump storage, about 5%. And compressed air storage, combined cycle standby, and don't ask me the details of that, about 5%. And so, you know, most scenarios look at a mix of renewables providing our power. And again, my analysis thinks solar is going to take off more than that, but even if it stayed at 35%, there's a way to reach it. Biomass, and some of this too is controversial in the way it's produced, so we need to be careful with biomass, but it includes things like livestock manure, crop residues, firewood, cities garbage, aquatic plants, which is, I think, actually a very good way of doing it, possibly. Solar. And the good news that solar will be the world's biggest single source of energy by 2050, according to the recent estimate by the International Energy Agency. And currently it's responsible for just a fraction of 1%. So solar that can really take off here. Solar energy is on track to be as cheap or cheaper than average electric bill prices in 47 US states. That's assuming the US maintains its 30% tax credit on system costs. But even if the tax credit drops to 10%, solar will soon reach the price parity with conventional electricity in well over half the nation, 36 states. So solar is becoming comparable in price to other energy sources. And I think it's going to continue on that track and actually become cheaper in sometime in the foreseeable future. Germany, we have Germany not a particularly sunny country. But Germany has set a new record with solar power providing 50% of its electricity in the middle of the day on Monday, June 9th, 2050. So if they can do it in Germany, it's not a sunny place. Indeed, more than 90% of the world's population lives in countries with substantially more sunlight. There's also possibilities of solar thermal storage. And the reason solar power generation will increasingly dominate as a technology, not a fuel, is such efficiency increases and prices fall as time goes on. The price of Earth's limited fossil fuels tends to go to in the other direction. How many of you in this room have used this? How many of you still use this on a daily basis? Yeah. And so we see with things like technology, there's often a slow development of that, and then they'll take off. Technology is kind of a non-linear. Once the technology becomes hugely accepted, and that's the hope with solar and other renewables. Once the development of them and the acceptance of them starts to multiply, they'll increase in a non-linear fashion. It also creates jobs and community investment. These renewables do. Inner city and small town America have been negatively impacted over the past decades by a failure to invest in their growth. I come from one of these high school in one of these smaller towns and went back there for my high school reunion. So it's half the size that it was when I was there. The high school is gone. It was a high school of over 1,400 people at the time. And so there's a need to reinvest. And the good news in this is, it's not renewables versus jobs. Actually, green-collar jobs provide an opportunity to reclaim these areas for the benefit of the local residents. For new transit spending and energy audits in inner cities, to windmills and biomass in our nation's heartland, green jobs mean a reinvestment in the communities hit hardest in recent decades. Let's say we invested $150 billion annual level of clean energy investments in the U.S. economy. That's not all federal, but that would just be a total investment. This would increase a net increase of 1.7 million jobs, would generate roughly a 1 percentage point fall in the employment rate. And this is really important. It includes 3.2 more jobs overall than if you did the same in fossil fuel investments, 3.6 more jobs requiring high school degrees or less, and these are the folks suffering most in our current economy. 2.6 more jobs requiring college degrees or more, and 3 times more jobs requiring some college. And so it provides jobs across the spectrum, but particularly for those folks that have high school degrees or less. A lot of hands-on work. And these are not MIC jobs. These are good jobs with decent earning potential. Carpenters, construction laborers, electricians, insulation workers, roofers, machinists, sheet metal workers, bus drivers, industrial truck drivers, truck and bus specialists. And what can you do? Continue to study and act. Make an energy efficiency pledge, home and congregation. Support the transition to renewables, TVA, and share your concerns about climate in a loving way. And so that's in essence my presentation. And so we'll open it up for, let me just get a chair here and I'll kind of sit down. And John, why don't you come up and join me? We'll get a chair and we'll have a conversation here around this. Questions you have, thoughts? Yes, Jim.
There is an omission, and that omission in your presentation is the effect of CO2 on ocean acidity, which really threatens the food chain, oceanic food chain. And that's harder to present, but it's a real threat.
Thank you.
Jim is mentioning that you're going from essentially a base condition now with a pH, I think, of 8.1 or so, and it's tending toward becoming more acidic. It's not acidic at this point, but it's tending in that direction. If you go that direction, that's not good.
It makes it harder for anything that has a shell, including the basic organisms and food chain, to make that shell.
Joe?
If you travel west of the Mississippi River, particularly Oklahoma, New Mexico, parts of Kansas, Colorado, Arizona, you will see acres and acres and acres of wind turbines. As far as your eye can see in some cases. So what do you estimate is the current percentage of energy being generated by wind turbines today?
You know,
I don't know.
yeah, I'm not sure. It's just, I don't have the exact answer to that. It's still less than 10%, I know that. Probably down around 5, probably, or less. It's still not a major percentage yet. Renewables, you're right. You see them growing at an exponential pace, but at the same time, their overall percentage is still fairly slow. I'm not slow, but low. Yes.
I don't know if this is, if there's an answer, but there are some who think this is just a lot of malarkey.
Mm-hmm.
They don't believe it at all. There's always been change, and we're in a
Mhm.
natural process of change. But how do you respond to that?
The best,
In an easier,
yeah.
simple way.
The best way I try to, is the response I think you just saw. And I try to acknowledge again that science always raises more questions than it answers. Acknowledge people that are in that space, and if they're coming from a questioning point of view rather than just a purely partisan point of view, try to address those questions as best I can. That's why I talked about how the Earth has gone through these different cycles, and that there is a scientific consensus, and again that climate fingerprinting. And so if people are coming from a space of, they have some uncertainties about what they've heard, and try to acknowledge those uncertainties, not attack folks because of those uncertainties, but try to address it in as rational a manner as I can. And if people are just coming from a purely partisan type of space, then all you can try to do is try to treat that person with respect, but know that they're also, we tend to worry a lot about those folks, but they're actually in a fairly small minority, less than 10% of the population. They tend to have very loud voices, and they're often white males, who like to dominate things, and often will try to take over a space like this if they're here. And so
We don't have those here, do we?
yeah, I don't think so. I don't think I've seen any of them. And so again, I want to acknowledge the genuine uncertainty that's out there, but not let those folks drive the conversation. Because if you get in a loop with those folks, it'll be just kind of this endless loop. And I think that's what the climate, we often over-address their concerns and get in this loop with them. And so avoid that loop, treat people with respect, but then really focus on the folks that are passionate about it, and also the folks that are in the mass middle, which are really the folks that, as the gentleman for the Autobus Society said, that those are the folks that really are going to make a difference in this. The passionate folks will make a big difference by building a movement, and the other folks, need to essentially get on board with the program, but that often happens through, again, that's why this education is extremely important. Caroline?
Well, the minute she said that, I thought, I'm so glad someone brought that up. I was with a group of about 7 or 8 people several years ago, and we had heard the same thing. We'd been visiting Panama, and we were there to get a tour of at the time was the building of this new Panama Canal. But this naturalist spoke to us, and he talked about what we've heard here today, that the birds are so confused, that they're in Central America, that 20 years ago they could give you practically the month and the date that certain birds would come through there, they'd start nesting and this and that. And he says, it can't. And he said, and there were a lot of Canadian people there that day. And he says, now I wish more of our North Americans were like you Canadians. And I thought, what does he mean by that? He said, and he smiled and he said, you know, one of our big neighbors has so politicalized it that they can't have a decent discussion. Well, I knew he was talking about us. So some other people that along on that thing, we were sitting talking, and we had gathered for storytelling. And one man stopped the whole thing. And sometimes we're guilty of thinking, well, it's the uneducated. And here today we have a former Sewanee professor, 2 Vanderbilt professors. This gentleman was a Vanderbilt professor. I used to remember what he was teaching. I remember he was Mormon. But he just threw cold water on it. He says, oh, the planet's going to endure. This has been going on for cycles. This cycle's for millions of years. And everybody else just changed the subject to who was the best storyteller there that day. And that was it. Oh, this is an issue that she brought up.
Yeah, and so we can't, it's very tough to do.
Was that guy considered an expert, unquote?
Yeah, and we're in a very partisan, divided place in this country right now, which is there really isn't this shouldn't be a partisan issue. In fact, it's the Republicans, for instance, that created the EPA and things like that.
How did we vote in the Paris, the end of the Paris?
We actually, I think, with our commitments, we were able to make that agreement happen. The United States has actually been one of the kind of the holdouts in a lot of this, but with the passage of the recent Clean Air Act, that was a very important piece of legislation, although it's kind of on hold right now in the Supreme Court, but that helped show that the United States was moving towards this. Our agreements with China on this. China is a very key partner in all of this. If China, it's actually the fact that nations like China are industrializing that's causing some of this major spike in all of this. And so it's countries like China and India and Brazil, major developing countries that will need to be on board in a clean energy future. And so it's going to need to, but.
And they are. India just ratified it.
Yeah, India just ratified it. China is suffering from extreme air pollution problems in their cities. So their middle class folks in particular aren't particularly happy about this. And so folks are really, and they are looking at seriously what a clean energy future looks like. But it's a real challenge. I mean, this is on the one hand, it's very simple. All we need to do is decarbonize. So it seems like a very simple thing to do. And it's a very doable thing to do, and I hope my presentation points that out. It's extremely doable, but it means that we do need to, the way I put it and the way I'm going to put it in my next presentation is that it's often, in a certain respect, it's a health concern. Not in terms of our individual health, although that's caught up in all this. We're dependent on all these natural systems, including the atmosphere system. And when our body becomes unhealthy, it's often a tough thing to accept. But it's also something that one needs to address, and one needs to address it seriously. One doesn't stop going on the rest of our lives, but one needs to accept it and make that a priority and take it on. And so we do that by caring for ourselves. If a relative is sick, we care for a relative or a friend. And we also, the systems, the larger systems, the healthcare systems are extremely important in all that. In this sense, it's the whole, in a certain respect. It's unhealthy, so we all need to address that. But we're also all caught up in these high energy systems. None of us are, if we drove our car here, we didn't intend to throw carbon into the atmosphere, but that's what we do, and we drive our car here. So we're caught up in these large systems that we need to change these large systems. And that's a challenging thing to do, because these systems are providing us with our basic necessity to stay warm or to transport ourselves and things like that. And so it's both a huge challenge, at the same time it's very doable, but it's something that we kind of need to break through these barriers of resistance around it that kind of drive up. One other point, and I'll turn over to John. When talking to folks, that are in a different position, it usually doesn't help to attack their position. What one does is one comes back, and both the research and I think just personal dynamics show this, is address your personal concerns. I'm concerned about the birds. I'm concerned about what's going to happen to my children or my grandchildren. I'm concerned about the lake I go to on vacation. I'm concerned, and share your concerns in a personal way as opposed to attacking somebody's position. And it's harder for people to come back and attack your concerns, but it also personalizes it. And it might help diffuse the situation somewhat. Huh?
Oh, I wanted to back up for just a moment. Your questions reminds us, or should remind us all, that when we had the Kyoto Treaty, our country was one of three that did not ratify it. I mean, the president was behind this. It did not go through the Senate. It never got ratified by our country. And there's a concern now that while we've signed off on the present Paris Treaty, that if it indeed comes to a vote in the Senate, for example, to force a ratification of what we've done, that it might not pass again. So there's certainly going to be an opportunity for all of us to write senators, et cetera, and try to put some pressure on this. Now, the other thing along this same line is if you'll, internet's a wonderful tool for all of us. If you'll get on and look up what's done about the Clean Power Plan that EPA has just come out with here a year ago, and then has further been pushed by the president, I think in February of this year. Well, many of the states have said, no, we're not going to adopt that. They've actually filed injunction trying to stop it, I think, against the government, trying to make EPA, I think, to repeal this or pull it off. But so it's going to take some pressure on our part. But this is a very important part of reducing the carbon dioxide that's released from power plants now. Each state supposedly is going to be asked to put forward their own plan to try and meet certain goals, and every state, okay? So by whatever means you do this, whether it's renewables, you transition existing power plants from coal-fired plants back to natural gas, any of these measures, that's a part of it. So each state can adopt its own plan, but they're expected to make a plan. So this is an important aspect. We need to try and make sure that the CPP goes through and is in effect and continued on with. Jim.
Well, I was going to add, partly in the response to you, I think one of the things you'll hear is, why should we do anything when other countries aren't? And the reality is, other countries are making this commitment. And one of the things I carry around is China is building 19 new nuclear plants right now, and India is building 7. And so other countries are making this commitment as well. And I think
This is a way to reduce the CO2 output from your electrical
yes,
grid by having nuclear power plants kind of pushed back on in our country. But other countries are continuing. So not only are the renewables a way to do this, but nuclear power, if we accepted that, would be a step in that direction as well.
I heard an interesting discussion on this the other day, comparing it to 30 years ago when we found the hole in the ozone. And the United States, as a whole, looked at this and went, science says there's a hole, here's what we can do. And the United States did not wait for any other countries to do something. We acted because it was the right thing to do, because we understood the science. And basically, we fixed that problem. Now,
That
this
was
is a
under
much
George
bigger
H.W.
problem,
Bush, yeah.
but it's the same. It should have the same mindset.
well, there was an international protocol, Montreal Protocol.
It was, but we didn't stand around and go, well, we're not going to do it unless China
Right.
does it. We're not going to do it unless India does it.
Well, then, you know, I really am disturbed that we are in a place in this country where science becomes politicized. I mean, we were so critical of the Soviet Union for essentially, if their scientists didn't agree with the Communist Party line, that they would end up in Siberia or whatever. And yet we seem to be doing the same thing in this country right now, and that's a disturbing trend. And it's not to say that everybody who questions aspects of climate change, because it is, again, there's a lot of complexity to it, are in that place. But I do think there are funding sources that have kind of made this a partisan issue, where it shouldn't be a partisan issue. We're all in this together. We're all going to be affected by it. What the partisan should do is, rather than challenging the science, we should have a debate about what to do about this. That's how our political system works. What mix of renewables, what mix of energy efficiency, how fast to go on things. That's part of how normal democracy works. But we shouldn't be arguing about the basic science of it.
Well, you mentioned the ozone hole, but fixing that didn't threaten oil companies or our way of life with cheap coal and cheap gasoline, which is a fix to this global warming is going to threaten the oil companies and coal companies and our car companies that will drastically be changed if we fix our global warming. So that's the difference here. Is that that's not, it's partisan, but sort of economic interests are going to be affected adversely, and so I put out the propaganda about climate dying. If people deny there's climate change, we won't worry about people trying to change our way of life.
Yeah, Bonnie?
You all are talking in grand generalities, and that's great. That's great. I'm learning a lot. I'd like to talk about something very specific that where I, and I'm sure other people, if not necessarily in the room, but are caught between a rock and a hard place. I live up in Madison in a condominium community. I have a very small front yard. I bought the condo because there was a tree there, one of those Bradford pears. Good. Cats, birds up, the second floor of my bedroom, whatever. Excellent. Came home less than a week later, and the tree was cut down. We hate trees and we hate birds in my condominium association. Gorgeous lilac bush cut down because it's easier to mow, Now, there's no way in heaven or hell I could have a solar panel or anything like that because there's so many rules and all. I have conversations with mockingbirds, but bless their hearts, they're on power lines and on the top of roofs. There's no tree anywhere around me for them to be in. And it's pitiful and it angers me tremendously. And I try to, not go there because there's nothing I can do about it. I drive 5 miles to recycle because there's no recycle pickup in Madison. Unless you, pay an individual or something $30 a month. Well, who's going to do that? So I want to do things, and I'm stuck. And I mean, I can help in the ways that we can go out into the community or the politicians or whatever like that. And I'm certainly willing to do that. But as an individual where I live, I'm crushed. Absolutely crushed. And I plant everything I can in my little front yard, which is like this, and in my patio I've got a billion plants and hangings and pots and everything like that. And always have. I come from a farming family.
Well, I think what you point out, Bonnie, is that
oxygen.
Yeah.
I mean, they don't even know that oxygen exists, apparently.
I think what you point out is that unless one makes a really, essentially a heroic effort, there's only so much an individual can do in all of this. But what individuals can do is we can all be part of this larger change where we change over the systems and also change over our culture. And so things like climate, like solar panels are not ugly, but they're now beautiful because they're moving us towards a more beautiful future. But until we accept that this is a major concern of ours, climate, we won't be able to make those moves. And so really the first change that needs to happen is that we really do need to, as a culture, embrace the fact that we do have this major health concern for our world and that we have to take it on. Before that happens, there's still things that we can have happen. I mean, we're all advocating for TVA. You got up at 3:30 in the morning with me and went to drive to Knoxville. And so there's also things we can do along the way. But until we see the sea change in our culture to say that this is something that we all need to take on. And that's why, it may seem like a very small thing when I go to a Sunday school class or something like that. But those are the spaces that I think that we need to kind of work right now, to do that cultural work and engage people around our deeper values to kind of bring this on. There's the advocacy piece, but then there's also this kind of larger embrace of all this. And the other thing is it's partly generational. I mean, sometimes people say paradigms are a major worldview. They don't necessarily, people don't get converted to one or the other, though some people do, but they just die off generationally. And so, some people may never embrace all of this, but some people will. And I think, younger generations are starting to really embrace some of this too.
This is probably an inadequate answer for your problem, but we have in the city at least lots of parks, lots of beautiful areas. If we'd support those, I think, and try to replant trees and bushes, et cetera, that would attract butterflies, on and on and on. That's maybe the only hope that you have directly of being able to help what's happening.
Oh, and we can't feed birds. We're not allowed to feed birds. I mean, it's just absurd.
Not even hummingbird either.
Well, you could sneak one, sure, on your patio. If it's on your patio, and I have a little hanging thing, and they do come in.
Yeah, Jim?
Well, this is an argument of Naomi Klein's, is that it's going to be a lot of small groups coming together about things like birds or some other small concern that also say, and part of our concern is climate change. That is, the culture has to change from the bottom up. It's not going to happen from the top down. There's too much money involved for a top-down change. It has to come from the bottom up. And it's sort of, when you're working on something, that is in some way a concern, birds, small concern, large concern, I'm not sure, different concerns to people here, to say part of that concern is climate change. And I can work with other groups that are also concerned in some way about climate change.
I don't fully understand how they record the temperatures. Where do they get their information? I mean, they talk about this is the warmest summer since forever. So where do they record this information?
There's lots of different, there are various science, John, maybe answer that better than I can.
Lots of weather stations.
Yeah, there's a
all
lot of
over
weather
the world.
stations that go.
And so you've got
Weather stations.
everywhere. There's lots of recording sites. So.
But do they take an average or what? It
I
certainly
would
would be
hope
different
so.
toward the poles than it would be
I
in
would
the
hope
middle.
so, that they have a really great way of averaging this over the entire year. We're talking about such small changes in temperature. And you first say, well, we're talking about a change of 2 degrees Celsius. That doesn't sound like a lot, yet it has this enormous effect on all these things. So it's tough to make these measurements, I think, but hopefully they've done a really super job through NASA and other agencies that would have come up with a worldwide temperature.
That is correct, NASA and other agencies, and they do
Yeah.
both globally and regionally. Like, for instance, we know that this summer was, there was a point at which this summer where the entire continental United States, for the first time ever, was higher than average. So they're looking at both globally and regionally and how all things changed. And we've grown some really smart, good scientists. That's who's doing it.
Yeah, and the scientists are doing, and that also brings up a point. I mean, all of parts of this are very complex, and I'm learning. I couldn't answer Joe's question entirely on the wind, the percentage of wind. I mean, there's so many pieces to all this, and so I think the takeaway from that for me is that I continue to learn those things, and I'm very engaged in it. But that your passion around this is kind of a reasoned passion around this, and then to kind of learn about it. But you don't have to master all that before you show your passion around this, show your concern around this, and then try to learn as much as you can. But again, there's, one can get very lost in all the myriad pieces of all of this. But again, it's very simple in a certain respect, that we just need to move away from fossil fuels. It's a very, despite all the complexity, the solution is fairly simple. Yeah, Francis?
Yeah, I'm always sort of amazed that there's, in a discussion like this, you don't hear much about the impact that agribusiness or food production makes a contribution also to global warming, particularly beef raising and on fertilizer that's used, and the food waste that we have that creates methane. That is seldom talked about, and I think that's important too. If someone's really concerned, that's something that an individual can do, as well as working with a larger change, for a larger change. But
yeah, you're right, Francis.
it's
Yeah.
just seldom mentioned.
Yeah.
Can I say one thing that's been very helpful to me is I like the books by Bill McKibben. I find them very readable, and I can understand it. Catherine Cahoe, if you're looking for the Christian perspective and how to talk, Catherine Cahoe writes on that. And then if you really want the science, and I gotta admit, couldn't even get past the first 3 chapters, The Storms of My Grandchildren.
James Hansen.
Hansen, there's your book.
Terrible writer.
Yeah, yeah.
That's part of the
But if you're
problem.
looking to, understand the science, he's the NASA science guy, and he will tell you that for me, Cahoe and McKibben are the two that I go, oh, okay. I can understand that.
Well, I hope this was helpful to you. Did the best that we could, and I hope we, this answered some of your questions and inspired you to do more. And
We'll be around the rest of the day, so maybe some of you can come and approach us directly.
Are there more meetings like this planned for next season and so forth?
yeah, there'll be plenty of opportunities through Tennessee Interfaith Power and Light to be involved. I'm also available, I can speak for myself, to come out and talk to any groups that.
Well,
so-
my sister has raised her children in the Catholic Christian faith. And, when Pope Francis issued his paper, 8-10 months ago, apparently he sent copies of it to every diocese in the world. And anyway, what I'm trying to say is her own priest, when he got the copy at their church, he made copies for every family in the church, and it's quite thick, and gave copies, and he said, and he gave a future date, I don't remember if it was 5 or 6 weeks. He says, some of you will throw these away, but for those of you who don't, and you read them, let's come together in a discussion group and let's discuss it. And I said to my sister, well, I wish we Methodists did that. So now I have something to share with her.
Okay, folks, yeah, and so continue your conversations around this, and there'll be plenty of opportunities to act on this through Interfaith Power and Light and other groups, and keep up the conversation. Thank you.
You go home to Maribel very
Terrible, that's the
All day. Christmas.